Farmer Tom here. Welcome to the Farmer Tomcast. And today on our ongoing series, Heroes of the Green, we've got legendary Southwest United States Attorney Ken Sobel. How's it going, Ken?
Good to see you again, Farmer Tom. It's been too long. You
Yeah,
look great.
buddy. Yeah, it definitely has. I think the last time we saw each other was, what state were we in?
It might,
Maybe
might
it's
have been
Florida.
Nevada.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Nevada,
or Florida.
Florida, Nevada, one of those places. Anyways, the world wants to hear Ken Sobel's story, and we want to hear it, buddy. So I'm giving the mic over to you.
Well, it's kind of you to think of me, and thank you so very much. And it's always a pleasure to be with you. Yeah, my story goes back. It's kind of in two parts. Back in the day, many years ago, because I am an old dog. But in the 70s, I was student body president at the University of Arizona. And at that time, there was a hotbed of a number of issues that were prominent on the national scene, including marijuana legalization, as we called it. Normal really had just begun. Some of the other organizations that later became big advocates for legalization, normalization of cannabis. But it was also in the time space of Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973. And so my role as student body president was to support Normal as a student organization, to support women's rights to be able to access contraceptives in the Roe versus Wade timeframe. And that lasted from my time at the University of Arizona from about 71 to 75. And then beyond that, I kind of served in a more normal existence, so to speak. For a few years, I served as a lobbyist, essentially, and a speechwriter for the AFL-CIO, the building and construction trades in Washington, D.C. And I was a speechwriter and lobbied for some of the labor issues that we had at the time. Met Cesar Chavez at the time. Never got to meet some of the other luminaries in the labor industry because I went on to law school in California not long after that. And beyond that, I had a regular sort of normal law career. But of course, here in California, when I was practicing in San Diego, in fact, when I took the bar exam in 1980, it was the first and only time that I could take the bar exam on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in California, and then flew over and took the Arizona bar exam on Thursday and Friday, and happened to pass them both on my first try. And that would later become important when we get back to cannabis and legalization. But in any event, of course, California in 1996 passed Proposition 215, as you well know. You have your roots here in San Diego. And it was the early part of 2000s before I began to pay any real attention to it. And that was at a time, Farmer Tom, when my mother-in-law, at a very young age, in her young 60s, had basically contracted terminal cancer. And I became her caregiver during the last basically 6 months of her life. She had brought home with her from the doctor's office all the opiates and other medications that they gave her. Someone along the way kind of elbowed me and said, Ken, you've got to try medical marijuana because it's really going to help her. And I saw with my own eyes the profound effects that medical marijuana had for her, and how incredibly helpful it was, and how she could put aside all of these opiates that kept her in a semi-comatose state. And she and I would play bridge together. So we continued to play bridge up until almost the last few weeks of her life. But that sparked my interest in making sure that other patients in California had safe access to cannabis. And I became an advocate, and I became involved in the industry to some degree. As you recall, under Prop 215, back in those days, we had collectives. And so I had some small grow operations and some small retail operations during that early period of time. But it was interesting to me at the value that cannabis added to folks, and it wasn't the demon drug that the federal government made it out to be. So that part of it was up till about 2008 or 9. And then in Arizona was considering passing their Arizona Medical Marijuana Act, and they would then become about the 8th or 9th state to pass a statewide medical marijuana program. And as I mentioned before, I had been a practicing law both in Arizona and in California, but mostly in California. And so I had gone back to Arizona to take care of my dad, who was ill with various problems, including Alzheimer's and dementia, and later on cancer. Went back to Arizona and became part of the advocacy to get AMA passed, which it passed in 2010 in Arizona by 5,000 votes statewide. All of those votes came from Pima County, where Tucson, some of your viewers, listeners might know. Pima County, where the University of Arizona is located, is Tucson, Arizona, and it's the kind of progressive part of the state. And Tucson and Pima County had provided about 45,000 more positive votes, and it was just enough to be able to win by 5,000 votes statewide the passage of the Arizona Medical Marijuana Act. So I became a pioneer in Arizona and organized the first 3 statewide organizations, consumers and business interests, to develop and promote AMA. We had members of the legislature who were not happy at all about Arizona passing a medical marijuana act. And so we had multiple lawsuits that we won, each and every one of them, Farmer Tom, in order to get the implementation of the act. And it literally took us about 2 years. At that point, I was able to open the 3rd retail establishment in Arizona, located in Tucson, called the Green Halo. And we also started our cultivation activities and otherwise became the only manufacturer of cannabis, edibles, and other products in Arizona. And we held that position for about 9 months. So for about 9 months, all the patients who received edibles and other forms of manufactured cannabis products got them through Nurse Heather. So I'd met Nurse Heather, who's been, I believe, on your program before. You know her well. She's my wife, my confidant, my love. And she and I met at the Patients Out of Time in Tucson, Arizona, 2012, and that was just celebrated our 10-year anniversary together. But Nurse Heather had come from New Mexico, where she started the first manufacturing, cannabis manufacturing there. And then she, along with me, developed the first cannabis manufacturing in Arizona. So that's how we got started. At the same time, Nurse Heather, a cannabis nurse, organized the Arizona Cannabis Nurses Association and is passionate advocates on behalf of patients generally, and specifically for veterans who had sustained injuries in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and had come home with post-traumatic stress disorder, not to mention the veterans of our era who were in Vietnam and also suffered from that. We decided to pursue requiring the state of Arizona to recognize and acknowledge that post-traumatic stress disorder should be a qualifying condition for cannabis use. And it had been a little bit of a mixed bag. There were a couple of states like California, which is very progressive, that allowed cannabis to be recommended for post-traumatic stress disorder, but many other states were either on the fence or had actually denied it. Well, we brought a petition against the Arizona, the health department, essentially, who regulated cannabis in Arizona. And we brought a petition, which they rejected. And then we took them to court. And we had a 4.5-day evidentiary hearing in Phoenix, Arizona. It was this Arizona Cannabis Nurses Association, represented by me, against the whole bureaucracy, really, of the state of Arizona. They hired the highest priced lawyers in the country, fully staffed, to fight us on this one simple issue. And we had a 4.5-day evidentiary trial. And at the end of that evidentiary trial, we won. And the judge recommended that cannabis be a qualifying condition for cannabis going forward in Arizona is post-traumatic stress disorder. And from that time, when we won that case, and it was really a landmark case, it was really the first time anybody had gone to court and proved essentially that, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that cannabis was safe and effective for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. We subsequently brought forth many other conditions, of course, but this was really a major, major victory, especially for our veteran community. And I emphasize that, but also we understood when we brought the case that the majority of people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, Farmer Tom, they're women suffering from domestic abuse or violence or other issues like that. And so it was a huge win. And we understood at the time in the science that really post-traumatic stress disorder is widespread, much bigger issue than people had ever thought it to be. But once we got that passed in Arizona, it spread like wildfire around the rest of the country. And there was a period of time there where each and every state that added a medical program, and we're now at 38 states, have pretty much completely added post-traumatic stress disorder as a qualifying condition. So that's where we were at that space. And then, as you know, it was only a couple of years later, because it was 2014 when we won our ultimate victory in Arizona. And by then, Nurse Heather and I had kind of moved back to California, and we were part of working on the state program, which California, we had two steps. One was in 2015 when the legislature passed the medical version of our state program, and it was 2016 in the general election when California approved its adult legal. But in any event, we came back to California. Fortunately, all these states that were coming on board for medical programs were adding PTSD. We then had Washington, as you know, your state, and Colorado come on board as the first adult programs. And at that time, as you recall, there was a little bit of controversy that folks like me and Nurse Heather and others and yourself who were really committed to the medical program, a lot of people expressed concern that by passing an adult program, we would then lose the sort of energy that we had behind cannabis as a medical product. I took a different view of it because my philosophy has always been, may God bless the FDA and keep them as far away from cannabis as possible. And the same thing with trying to keep the government. We didn't want to fight and win the war on prohibition, only to end up back with heavily regulations from federal and state governments on cannabis. And I felt then, as I do now, that by developing an adult program, that we were more likely than not to be able to escape the heavy regulation that would come from the government. And I think that will prove to be the case. We're now, I believe, at I think it was 16 or 17 states that are now either having adult program or have approved adult program. And that number will increase significantly over time. But that's kind of where we are now. Now, back here in California, I continue to work in helping people get licenses. I myself have multiple cultivation licenses and other operational licenses, including retail. And I help others get started in the business. And I've been heavily active in providing some of the equity for some of our Black and brown brothers and sisters who suffered more than we did in the lengthy prohibition that we had. But we still haven't forgotten our roots in the medical, and there's still a lot of room to grow and a lot of space to create. And so Nurse Heather and I, with a dear friend of ours who lost his son to cancer a few years ago, created a set of what became Senate Bill 311 here in California. It had another number a couple of years ago when we started the effort, but it's called Ryan's Law. And Ryan's Law was to deal with a situation in which my friend's son, who was from the state of Washington, he was actually in Seattle, and he was a very gifted special needs educator there. And he got pancreatic cancer, literally stage 4, and was hospitalized immediately. And the drugs that they gave him to control the pain were basically the opiates and so forth, the fentanyl. And Nurse Heather, Jim, our friend, told us about the situation. Nurse Heather got in contact with some of our professional friends in Washington and Oregon, and we got some medicine to him, some extract to young Ryan to help him with his pain. But the hospital refused to allow him to use it. Here's a man who's got a matter of weeks to live. So we had to find a hospital in Seattle that would allow him to have the cannabis medicines. We were able to do that. And within 12 hours of receiving the extracts and medicine that Nurse Heather created, he was almost pain-free. He was able to see his young 13-year-old son and his wife and his family and his friends and his teachers and his family and have meaningful time with them during these last 3 or 4 weeks of his life, because that's as long as he lasted. And so that became the genesis for Ryan's Law. Since his dad was here in California, in San Diego, and we had worked together on other projects, he asked me to help write this bill for Ryan's Law. And Ryan's Law now requires that hospitals and healthcare facilities in California, they are required to allow patients who are terminally ill to use cannabis in the facility. And so it started out, year one is Senate Bill 305. And the first year we got it passed in the Assembly, all 70 members of the Assembly voted yes. All 40 members of the Senate voted yes, every Democrat, every Republican, every independent. And I had negotiated with the hospital association who opposed it when the bill was in the Assembly. And I had written into that law to safeguard their revenues, that they were afraid that they might lose the money from Medicare reimbursement. So I created a safe harbor, so to speak. And I thought we had resolved our issues with the hospital association, but instead they snuck in through the back door and they got Governor Newsom to veto the bill. So the first version of it, SB 305, we lost as a veto. The second version came about as we were just getting into COVID, and the legislature told us, look, Ken, we know this is a great bill, but this is COVID. We just can't get to that. So it was just last year, Farmer Tom, that we were able to get Senate Bill 311. And again, it passed with almost unanimously. We had one Republican holdout from Northern California who had an axe to grind with our senator who was sponsoring the bill. But needless to say, except for that one negative vote, it passed almost unanimously. And on September 28th of 2021, Governor Newsom did sign it into law. And so since January 1 now, we have the compassionate access to cannabis, or Ryan's Law, which now allows any patient who's terminally ill to be able to access cannabis while they're in the hospital or in a healthcare facility. So we continue to sort of chip away, as I said, with the adult in place, with the medical growing now, as I said, 38 states. We see that time coming when we can normalize how cannabis is used as a traditional medicine and begin to bridge cannabis as an herbal medicine with the medical system itself. And so SB 311, Ryan's Law, bills like that, California just passed finally a bill that requires employers to prove actual use by an employee before they can discipline them. And a number of other bills passed this term. So we continue to, Nurse Heather and I continue to work on that. I continue to work on these issues because I think there's more and more we can do. And I won't be happy until every person understands that cannabis is a nutritional supplement. In California, it's not a drug. It's an agricultural commodity. And that's what it needs to be treated as, a nutritional supplement. So that's kind of what we've been up to. It brings us pretty much to the present time. We're here in 2022. The next step for Ryan's Law is we'll add to the terminal ill patients, we'll add to patients who are receiving palliative care. And that, of course, will expand everything substantially. And with that bill, we've now attracted the interest of 14 other states. California, of course, was the first to pass it. We have 14 other states. We have teams that we're building up in Washington and Oregon and many, many other states. And hopefully by the end of this year, 2022, we'll have passed more Ryan's Laws in those states as well. So, I guess I should take a breath at some point, but that's kind of where we are. And I'm still here in San Diego, California. Nurse Heather and I are still working on these issues and tried to help people along the way.
Well done, Ken. Man, let's hope Ryan's loss spreads like the PTSD one across the country, because patients really need to have access in the hospitals. There's no doubt about it. So, man,
Absolutely.
I get chills when I hear all these stories, man. This has been a great, this whole, Heroes of the Green project. This has been great to actually hear
Yeah.
all the groundbreaking work that all my friends did. It tickles me. So, where can people find you, and what are some of the groups that you support and you want to give a shout out to? And if you're comfortable giving your email address or whatever, if they're looking for
Sure.
some assistance, can you give us that?
Yeah, so it's Ken Sobel, spelled Sobel, Ken Sobel. I'm in San Diego. You can reach me by cell at 619-208-2439. You can reach me with email at kennysocal711@gmail.com. Kenny, like Southern California, Kenny SoCal, SOCAL 711@gmail.com. And I'm involved in a lot of little local organizations where I attend meetings sometimes, but not all the time. I have my business is known as Genesis International Cannabis Consulting, and so I work with folks all over the U.S. I may have mentioned this, or maybe I didn't, but I wrote the bill, the cannabis bill, for the U.S. Virgin Islands, and they're just now getting their program underway. It took a while, but they just finally posted some regulations, and they're getting license applications out. And that's St. Thomas and St. Croix. And then I'm just active, with these various issues that come up from time to time, advocating on behalf of patients. So, and right here in San Diego, Southern California.